I heard from people who were very, very much involved 20-odd years ago, more than 20 years ago, in resurrecting Camilla. Their job was to take her from the mistress in 1996 and get her to be queen.
You know how royal announcements typically work, right? Everything goes through multiple levels of approval. Press offices coordinate timing. Communications teams craft carefully worded statements that get released at respectable hours, usually mid-morning, sometimes early afternoon. Never, and I mean never, at midnight. So when Buckingham Palace issued a statement at literally 2 minutes before midnight on February 3rd, 2026, every single royal watcher in the world knew something massive had just happened. Something they absolutely didn't want the press to have time to dig into before the next news cycle. Here's what the statement said, and I want you to pay attention to every word because the legal language here is incredibly specific. In accordance with the Sealed Covenant Trust, executed by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and witnessed by legal counsel in 2020, the property known as Thornwick Estate shall pass in full and exclusive guardianship to His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, effective immediately. Now, if you're a casual observer of the royal family, you might be thinking, okay, William inherited a property from his grandmother. That seems normal. But if you know anything about how the monarchy actually operates, about how royal properties are managed and transferred, about the legal mechanisms involved, you'd immediately recognise that everything about this announcement is absolutely extraordinary. First of all, most people had never even heard of Thornwick Estate. It doesn't appear on any official list of royal properties. There are no photographs of it in the royal archives. No journalist has ever been allowed to visit. It's never been mentioned in any biography, memoir, or historical account of the royal family. For all intents and purposes, this estate didn't exist in the public consciousness until that midnight announcement, and there's a very specific reason why it was kept secret, because Queen Elizabeth didn't want certain people knowing it existed, and by certain people, I specifically mean Queen Camilla and her son, Tom Parker Bowles. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start from the beginning, because this story goes back decades, and understanding how we got here is absolutely crucial to understanding what's happening now. Thornwick Estate is located in a remote area between Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. We're talking about roughly 900 acres of heavily wooded land, ancient cedar groves that are centuries old, a Georgian manor house that's never appeared in any architectural survey, 3 working farms that generate significant agricultural income, a glacial-fed lake, and most importantly, a 15th century stone chapel that contains something the public has never seen. According to sources who've had access to palace briefing documents, the estate was originally purchased in 1952, just months after Elizabeth became queen. But here's the fascinating part. The property wasn't registered under the royal family's name. It wasn't part of the Crown estate. It wasn't connected to the Duchy of Lancaster or Cornwall. Instead, it was held through a private trust company managed by one of the Queen's personal financial advisors. The whole point was absolute privacy. This wasn't a place for state functions or diplomatic receptions or photo opportunities. This was where the Queen went when she needed to be Elizabeth Windsor, not Elizabeth Regina. No security details announcing her arrival, no ladies in waiting following her around, no equerries with briefing folders. Just her, and later, occasionally, William. Now, the chapel I mentioned, that's where things get really interesting. Inside that chapel is an engraved memorial vault containing the names of every royal family member who served in armed conflict going back to World War I. But that's just what you can see. Below the chapel, accessed through a stone stairway that most people don't even know exists, there's a network of archival vaults. And what's in those vaults is absolutely staggering. According to palace archivists who've been granted limited access, we're talking about 186 oak chests containing personal war correspondence, internal royal communications that were never meant for public eyes, diplomatic cables from World War II. There are 72 royal portraits that have never been publicly displayed, including oil paintings of King George VI and Princess Margaret that were commissioned but never shown. But perhaps most significantly, there are 14 sealed audio recordings. These are private conversations between Queen Elizabeth II and world leaders. We're talking about Winston Churchill, Nelson Mandela, Ronald Reagan, Charles de Gaulle. Not the official state conversations that got recorded for historical purposes, but the private, off-the-record discussions where they actually said what they thought. One archivist who was granted access to catalogue the materials described the collection this way: "This isn't a museum of history, this is the raw, unfiltered architecture of royal memory." Now, Prince Philip reportedly hated Thornwick. He thought it was too isolated, too cold, not enough shooting opportunities. He visited maybe 3 or 4 times in the entire length of their marriage and made it clear he had no interest in returning. Princess Anne spent some time there in the 1970s, but was more interested in her own country pursuits. Prince Charles, according to multiple sources, he never once visited the estate. Not as a child, not as a young man, not even after he became king. But William spent significant, meaningful time at Thornwick, especially in the last years of his grandmother's life. Sources say that between 2017 and 2021, William would regularly spend long weekends at the estate with the Queen. And these weren't ceremonial visits, these weren't photo ops. This was serious work. They'd walk through the cedar groves together, sometimes for hours, discussing history, talking about duty, exploring what it means to be a steward of the monarchy rather than just a figurehead. William would spend time in the archive vaults, carefully cataloguing naval dispatches, refiling hundreds of letters from World War II soldiers, even helping to repair the moisture control systems that keep the documents preserved. Former staff members describe his work as meticulous, respectful, and deeply engaged. One person who worked at the estate during this period put it this way: he wasn't there to perform royal duties, he was there to learn stewardship, and the Queen wasn't just showing him property, she was teaching him about institutional memory, about preserving what matters, even when no one's watching. And the Queen kept notes about these visits, detailed notes. In her private papers, there's a handwritten annotation that reads, "He will inherit more than the crown. He will inherit the silence that preserved it." Now, this is where the legal structure becomes absolutely crucial to understand, because Thornwick Estate isn't like Balmoral or Sandringham. Those are private royal properties, yes, but they're still subject to certain regulations and oversight mechanisms. Thornwick is something different entirely. In 2020, 3 years before she died, Queen Elizabeth created what's called a covenant trust. This is a very specific legal mechanism that allows property to be transferred with ironclad conditions that cannot be challenged, modified or circumvented. The trust was filed under Charter Seal 0142, which is a designation that means it was witnessed by the Queen's personal solicitor, a constitutional advisor, and a notary representative from the Royal Archives. But here's the key detail. The trust contained what's called a delayed activation clause. It would only take effect after 3 specific conditions were met. The Queen had to pass away, her state funeral had to be concluded, and Prince William had to be publicly recognised as the heir apparent to institutional responsibility. All 3 of those conditions were met in late January 2026, and on January 31st, the land registry was quietly updated. Prince William became the sole legal owner of Thornwick Estate. Not shared ownership, not custodianship with oversight, complete, absolute ownership. And here's where Camilla and Tom Parker Bowles enter the story in a big way. According to multiple palace sources, Camilla first learned about Thornwick's existence sometime in late 2023. She didn't know all the details, didn't know about the archives or the Queen's specific plans, but she knew there was a private estate that wasn't part of the official royal holdings. And from that moment, she became obsessed with it. By early 2024, Camilla had begun what insiders describe as a quiet campaign to position herself as a moderniser of royal heritage properties. She started giving speeches about how the monarchy needed to make better use of its assets, how private estates could be converted into cultural centres or educational venues, how the royal family had a responsibility to share its heritage with the public. On the surface, this all sounds very reasonable, progressive even, but people close to the situation say there was a very specific property she had in mind and a very specific plan for what would happen to it. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, had been going through a rough period professionally. Some of his food brand partnerships had fallen through. Media deals hadn't worked out the way he'd hoped. He was looking for a new project, something that could leverage royal connections without technically violating the rules about commercialising the monarchy. And when he learned about Thornwick, he saw exactly what he'd been searching for. Documents that later leaked show that Tom's team had developed an incredibly detailed business plan. They wanted to convert Thornwick into what they called a luxury heritage culinary retreat. High-end farm-to-table dining experiences using produce from the estate's farms. Exclusive wine tastings in the historic cellars, artisanal food production with branding tied to the estate's history. The revenue projections, over £60 million across a 10-year period. And Tom would be positioned as the creative director, the face of the venture. Not technically a working royal, but someone who understood both heritage and modern business. Camilla reportedly loved this idea. It would give Tom legitimacy and income. It would position her as a forward-thinking royal who understood commercial realities. And it would generate substantial revenue that could flow through her charitable foundations, giving her independent financial power within the royal structure. In late 2024, Camilla started laying very careful groundwork. She began hosting private dinners with heritage donors, cultural investors, food critics. She'd mentioned in passing that the royal family had underutilised properties. She'd float ideas about public-private partnerships. She'd gauge reactions, build relationships, create networks. By mid-2025, things were getting more concrete. Tom had brought in architectural consultants to draw up renovation plans. They'd explored whether portions of Thornwick could be claimed under public heritage laws. The argument would be that because the estate had potential historical significance, it should be operated for public benefit rather than private use. It was an incredibly clever legal strategy. If they could get Thornwick reclassified from private property to some kind of cultural trust, they wouldn't need to own it outright. They'd just need to control how it operated, and that control would give them everything they wanted. In October 2025, Tom's legal team even prepared a briefing note exploring whether the estate's wartime origins might qualify it for cultural reclassification. They were building a case carefully and methodically for why Thornwick shouldn't remain in private hands. Then in November 2025, Camilla made her boldest move yet. She hosted a private reception at a countryside manor near Henley-on-Thames. Officially, the event was about celebrating rural sustainability and British agricultural heritage. But according to people who attended, the real purpose was something else entirely. Camilla was floating a new model for royal property management. She called it the public-private stewardship model. The idea was that certain royal estates could be jointly operated by the royal household and charitable organisations. In this case, specifically the Crown Charitable Council, which was directly tied to Camilla's foundation, and the estate she kept. Mentioning, without ever quite naming it directly, was clearly Thornwick. William was invited to this reception, and his response tells you everything you need to know about how he viewed Camilla's plans. He declined, politely but firmly, and according to sources, he made sure his decline was noted by everyone who mattered. 3 weeks later, William did something that caught Camilla completely off guard. He activated the Covenant Trust. Now, Camilla didn't know the Covenant Trust existed. She didn't know that the Queen had spent years creating an ironclad legal mechanism specifically designed to prevent what Camilla was trying to do. She thought she was building influence and relationships and positioning. She thought she was being clever. But the Queen had outmaneuvered her from beyond the grave. On January 31st, 2026, the Land Registry was updated, and on February 3rd, that midnight palace statement went out. By the time Camilla learned what had happened, it was already over. According to sources who were present, Camilla was at Clarence's house when one of her aides showed her the palace statement on a phone. She read it once, then read it again, then went completely silent for about 45 seconds. And then, according to people who were there, she said something that cannot be repeated in a family-friendly video. But what she did over the next 72 hours tells you everything about how she viewed this situation. Within hours, she had her legal team on an emergency conference call. She wanted to know if there was any way to contest the transfer, any legal mechanism to challenge it, any argument about public interest, or shared family inheritance or joint governance. And her lawyers had to deliver devastating news. There was nothing they could do. The Covenant Trust was absolutely airtight. It had been properly executed, properly witnessed, properly filed, and it contained specific legal language that made any challenge impossible. But Camilla wasn't someone who accepted defeat easily. Over the following days, she reportedly explored multiple different angles. Could she petition King Charles to intervene? Could she argue that the estate should be shared among all senior royals? Could she claim that the Queen's wishes were outdated and needed to be updated for modern circumstances? And this created an incredibly uncomfortable situation for Charles, because he was trapped between his mother's explicit final wishes and his wife's fury. According to palace insiders, Camilla made it very clear that she felt betrayed, that the Queen had deliberately excluded her family, that William was being selfish by keeping the entire estate for himself when it could benefit the broader royal family. But Charles couldn't do anything, even if he wanted to, because the Covenant Trust wasn't just legally binding. It contained specific language anticipating exactly this kind of pressure. The Queen had written that her wishes regarding Thornwick were final and could not be modified by sentiment, family politics, or changing circumstances. Princess Anne, who had known about the Covenant Trust for years, reportedly shut down any discussion of compromise with a single devastating sentence: "You do not challenge the last wish of the sovereign, you honour it." Meanwhile, Tom Parker Bowles was dealing with the complete collapse of his entire business plan. He'd spent over a year developing this concept. He'd brought in investors, created financial projections, built relationships with people who thought they were going to be part of a major royal heritage project. And now it was all worthless. Without access to Thornwick, there was no project. His investors pulled out immediately. His partnerships dissolved. And according to sources close to Tom, he personally blamed William for destroying what he viewed as a legitimate business opportunity. But the conflict was about to get even more complicated, because Thornwick wasn't the only estate involved. As palace staff began reviewing the Queen's full estate documents, they discovered that Thornwick was just one of several properties the Queen had quietly transferred to William through similar legal mechanisms. There was Ashford Manor, a 600-acre property in Berkshire with its own set of historical archives. Greystone Downs, an 800-acre conservation estate in Northumberland. And Millbrook House, a smaller but strategically important property near Windsor. Each one had been transferred through the same kind of covenant trust. Each one contained similar legal protections, and each one represented a different aspect of what the Queen wanted to preserve. And Camilla and Tom had apparently had plans for several of them. Documents later leaked showing that Tom had explored converting Greystone Downs into what he called a wellness heritage resort. The plan included luxury eco-lodges at £5,000 per night, a farm-to-table culinary programme that he would personally host, and a members-only royal culinary circle targeting elite clientele from the UAE and East Asia. The projected value? Over £80 million. Tom had even registered a company in Luxembourg 3 weeks before the Queen's will details became public. The company was called Stag Crown Hospitality Limited, and according to internal documents, it was specifically created to manage the anticipated Greystone Downs venture. When William learned about this through Princess Anne, who'd intercepted communications between Camilla's lawyers and potential investors, he reportedly said something that palace staff remember verbatim: "She's not challenging the crown, she's challenging my grandmother's ethics." And that's when William went from defensive to proactive. In early February 2026, William instructed his legal team to conduct a comprehensive review of every property the Queen had transferred to him. He wanted to understand exactly what legal protections were in place, what vulnerabilities might exist, what Camilla and Tom might try next, and what they discovered was remarkable. The Queen hadn't just protected these properties legally, she'd protected them strategically, psychologically, even emotionally. Each covenant trust contained what lawyers called an anticipatory obstruction clause. This was legal language specifically designed to prevent challenges from people who weren't part of the direct Windsor bloodline or who had married into the family after a certain date. The cut-off date: 2010, which meant Camilla, who married Charles in 2005, technically wasn't excluded. But Tom, who had never been a royal family member, absolutely was. And Any company or entity he controlled would be automatically disqualified from having any claim or interest in the properties. When this clause was read aloud to senior royals in a private meeting at Windsor, people who were present described the reaction as stunned silence. Camilla, who was reportedly in an adjacent corridor, stormed out. Tom was said to have cursed loudly over the phone when his lawyers explained that his entire business strategy was legally impossible. But Camilla still had one more card to play, and it was perhaps her most desperate and dangerous move yet. In mid-February, sources say Camilla instructed her legal advisors to explore whether they could challenge the Queen's mental state at the time she created these covenant trusts. The argument would be that the Queen had been unduly influenced by William and Catherine, that her decision-making had been compromised, that she hadn't fully understood the implications of what she was doing. In other words, Camilla was preparing to attack Queen Elizabeth II's competence and judgment. When word of this reached King Charles, his reaction was swift and devastating. Despite being in poor health himself, Charles issued what palace sources describe as the sternest warning of his reign. Any attempt to tarnish the Queen's will shall be treated as sedition against the Crown's memory. The statement was leaked to the Times within 48 hours, and the public reaction was massive. Constitutional scholars called Camilla's potential legal strategy morally reprehensible. Royal historians said it would be an unprecedented attack on a deceased monarch's legacy. Pro-monarchy groups organised in defence of the Queen's memory. And Catherine, Princess of Wales, made a move that may have been the most effective response of all. She didn't issue any statement. She didn't comment to the press. She simply made a quiet visit to a children's hospice near Windsor, where she was photographed holding children's hands and reading stories. The visual contrast was perfect. Catherine caring for vulnerable children, while Camilla allegedly schemed over inherited property. The press coverage was brutal for Camilla and sympathetic beyond measure for Catherine and William. Within a week, Camilla's legal team had backed down completely. No challenge would be filed. No questions would be raised about the Queen's mental state. Tom's Luxembourg company was quietly dissolved, and Camilla issued a terse statement saying she respected Her late Majesty's intentions. But the conflict had revealed something profound about the fault lines within the royal family. This wasn't just about property or money or business opportunities. This was about fundamentally different visions of what the monarchy should be. William and Catherine represented one vision: stewardship, preservation, duty over profit. The belief that royal heritage exists to be protected for future generations, not monetised for current advantage. Camilla and Tom represented another vision: modernisation, commercialisation, leveraging royal connections for economic benefit. The belief that heritage should generate revenue and that royal status should translate into business opportunities. And the Queen, through her estate planning, had made an absolutely definitive choice about which vision she supported. On February 18th, 2026, William made his first official visit to Thornwick Estate as its legal owner. He brought Catherine and all three children. No press was invited, no photographers were allowed, just a quiet family visit to understand what they'd been entrusted with. Local residents near the estate reported seeing them walking along the lake at sunset. William was pointing out different features of the property to George, explaining the history, talking about what it had meant to his great-great-grandfather during the war. Charlotte was carrying what looked like a leather-bound journal, possibly one of the Queen's private diaries from the archives. Louis was running ahead on the forest paths, completely carefree. And the message in those images, when they inevitably leaked to the press, was crystal clear. This wasn't about ownership in a transactional sense. This was about guardianship, about family legacy, about preserving something precious that had been passed down through generations. But the story still wasn't over. Because in late February, something else emerged that changed the entire conversation about the Queen's estate planning. Palace archivists, while cataloguing materials at Thornwick, discovered a sealed letter the Queen had written to be opened only if anyone challenged William's inheritance. The letter, dated February 2023, contained the Queen's own explanation of why she'd made the decision she had. Parts of the letter have been leaked to royal correspondence, and the language is absolutely devastating in its clarity. The Queen wrote, I leave these properties to William not because of birth order or favouritism, but because he alone has demonstrated the understanding that preserves rather than profits. I have watched him catalogue documents with the same care I once did. I have seen him repair moisture systems in archive vaults when he could have delegated to staff. I have observed him treat history as sacred trust rather than commercial opportunity. And then the most powerful line, Thornwick belongs not to power, but to patience. Let the one who bears the weight of the crown's future, not the burden of entitlement, carry it forward. When this letter was shared with senior royals, the reaction was mixed. Some saw it as the Queen's final vindication of William. Others saw it as an unnecessarily harsh judgment of other family members. But no one could deny its impact. For William, the letter represented validation of everything he'd worked for. His grandmother had seen his character, had tested his commitment, and had found him worthy of this trust. For Camilla, it was the ultimate exclusion. The Queen hadn't just left her out of the inheritance. She had explained in writing why Camilla didn't deserve to be included, that her vision of the monarchy was fundamentally incompatible with what the institution needed to survive. And for Tom Parker Bowles, it meant the end of any hope that he could build a royal-adjacent commercial empire. The Queen had closed that door permanently, and she'd done it with legal mechanisms that couldn't be challenged or circumvented. By March 2026, the situation had settled into an uneasy truce. Camilla stopped making any public references to royal heritage properties. Tom had moved on to other business ventures completely unconnected to the royal family, and Charles had made it clear through his private secretary that any discussion of the Queen's estate decisions was closed. But the inheritance had revealed something important about the future of the monarchy. William and Catherine weren't just the next generation of working royals. They were the guardians of institutional memory and values that went far deeper than public appearances and ribbon cuttings. The estates the Queen had left to William represented more than just property or wealth. They represented a choice, a declaration about what matters most: preservation over profit, duty over opportunity, stewardship over exploitation. And in making that choice so definitively, the Queen had sent a message that would echo through generations. Some people are born to wear crowns. Others are trusted to protect what crowns represent. William had proven himself worthy of that trust. And Thornwick Estate, with all its secrets and history and responsibility, would stand as permanent evidence of his grandmother's faith in him. As for Camilla and Tom, they'd learned a hard lesson about the difference between proximity to power and actual trust, about the gap between royal titles and royal values, about why some legacies can never be bought, sold or branded. The Queen had drawn a line, and from beyond the grave, she'd made absolutely certain that line would never be crossed.